Hey guys, welcome back if you're new here. My name is Becca and today I'm going to be sharing with you my most surprising reads of 2019. So I have 7 books to talk to you guys about today. None of these are my best books of the year. That video is still coming, but these are 7 books that I really enjoyed that I didn't expect to going into them. Now, of course, I do go into 90% of the books I read expecting to enjoy them, but these are ones that I thought I may have average opinions on, or that I thought I would like, but not to the degree that I ended up liking them. If you have already watched my most disappointing reads of 2019, you will know that I did rank the books in that video in order of least disappointing to most disappointing. However, I haven't done that with this video because I didn't feel like there was a ranking in here. This is just 7 books that I was surprised by how much I enjoyed. And as that is pretty much all the introduction that this video needs, I'm going to hop into the books, starting with the ones that I don't physically own. So the first book that took me by surprise was An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. Now, this is not a standalone, but at the time that I read it and the time that it was published, it was intended to be a standalone, but I do believe that the sequel is coming out in 2020, and you will see that on my most anticipated books of 2020 whenever I actually make that video. So this has a very complex plot for a reasonably short urban fantasy. This book is set in a modern day New York where magicians are secretly living. Now, every 20 years or so they have something called the turning, which is when all of the houses come forward and vie for power, and they have a magical tournament to the death to see which house will be ruling the magicians for the next 20 years. Now, there are so many plot lines going on in here. There's so much going on. It's so complex. So I'm not really going to dive into the synopsis more than that, but we do follow one character slightly more than the others, and that is a mysterious magician that has just turned up to compete in the turning. However, nobody knows who she is or why she's there, and as this is quite an established system that they have, this is quite a rarity. So I gave this book 5 stars, but I didn't expect to going into it, and the reason for that, quite simply, is that if you know anything about me, you know that I predominantly read series, and most of my highest rated books are books in series. Now, the reason for that is that I rate partially on attachment and enjoyment, and I never feel particularly connected to characters or a story that I only follow for one book. So for me to give this 5 stars and it make it on this list, with it being at the time of publication a standalone, is incredible. So one of the things about this book is that you will go into it not knowing anything, and it just kind of jumps into the story and you find out more as the story goes along. That, once again, is something that I traditionally don't like. I love an info dump at the beginning of a fantasy book because I want to go into the story knowing absolutely everything about the world, the characters, the politics, etc. I think the reason that this worked for me in this case, however, is because the way that Kat Howard littered clues throughout this book I found absolutely fascinating. So as I said, you start off knowing absolutely nothing, and Kat Howard gives you the time to make a prediction or come to your own conclusions, and then very shortly after that she will reveal the truth of that particular incident. So I really liked the way that she gave you time to come to your own conclusion, but then it didn't leave it too long before you got an answer to that, so you knew whether you were right or not. Something else I really enjoyed about this was the atmosphere. I love the way that New York was portrayed, and I really loved the way that magic was performed in this series. So they are magicians and they kind of manipulate the world around them, but the magic system is very intricate. There is a very specific gesture and a very specific way to harness magic in this world, and I really enjoyed the intricacy of that. But essentially this was just a really well crafted book for an urban fantasy standalone with a super complex plot, and I was just surprised and amazed at how much fit into this book and worked perfectly. I left this book with no questions, and yes, there wasn't as much world building and development as I'm used to in a fantasy story, but when I finished this book I was satisfied, and that's pretty much all I can ask for. The other book on this list that I don't have is Heartstopper Volume 1, or both volumes that are currently published of Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. So Heartstopper is a webcomic, you can read it for free, but volumes are also being published, which is a bind up of however many of the last issues to date. So this is a very strange story for me to love, because this is just a contemporary boy meets boy gay romance story. It's also strange that I enjoy this because the art style is super simplistic and the frames are massive, so the books are reasonably chunky, but there will just be 1 to 3 frames feelings on one page. Now, as I said, I am not particularly attached to characters that I only follow for one book, which means that I generally don't love contemporary that much. I do enjoy it, but I don't love it because in a standard young adult contemporary romance, the relationship does tend to be at the forefront and they do tend to be standalones. However, this was just so cute and so sweet and so wholesome, and I actually cried at the end of Heartstopper Volume 1, and it wasn't a sad moment, it was just a really touching moment. And for this to evoke emotion from me, given that it is a genre that I don't particularly love that much because it doesn't typically get me invested and evoke emotion from me, was incredible. So I would recommend that you check out this series. Like I said, you can read it for free if you just search the Heartstopper webcomic on Google, and even if it's not your thing, you may end up loving it like I did. Next up, we have a book that I read for Believeathon, and that is Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, which is the first book in his Dark Materials. Now, I am typically not a children's book reader. Every year I tend to read a few, but they don't necessarily appeal to me. However, my good friend Gavin from Gavin Hetherington did host a month-long middle grade readathon, and as he is one of my closest friends, I did participate. Now, this is a children's book, but it is also not a children's book. So we follow Lyra, who is a young girl in a world where people have demon companions that take animal forms. Lyra is an orphan, and she has been given pretty much as a ward to Jordan College in Oxford. Now, her uncle is an explorer, his base is Jordan College. Lyra has grown up with this adventurous streak where all she wants to do is adventure and journey to the north to see the Northern Lights and assist her uncle with his work. This has led to her being very mischievous, and she is a little bit of a pest around the college. Now, one day when her uncle is back from his latest exploration mission, she hides in the library where he is doing a presentation, and she makes some interesting discoveries about an unknown substance called dust that may be connected to the Northern Lights. In the background of this, there have been children going missing by a group called the Gobblers, and there is a little bit of fear surrounding that, but at this point nobody really knows if it's an urban legend or something that is actually happening. So that's kind of where the story kicks off. I didn't really know anything about this going into it, aside from that everybody really loves this series and it takes place in a snowy setting. So I was so thoroughly surprised and shocked when I went into this and I discovered that this is a children's book, but it also isn't a children's book. After reading this, I later learned that Philip Pullman never intended this to go into any age category, and I completely understand why, because like with the later books in the Harry Potter series, this can be enjoyed by people of any age. So the thing that I was shocked about is that the fantasy plotline and the fantasy world in this is so well developed and so complex, and it's written in such an intriguing way where a child would still be able to understand it, but then if you read it as an adult, there is so much more depth in here. I particularly like the atmosphere of this book, and I also really loved Philip Pullman's writing, but I think overall my favorite thing about this book was the seamless blend of a complex adult fantasy story and a children's adventure story, because I think that that is something that is really hard to pull off, and Philip Pullman managed it excellently. A very recent read for me, we have I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This is a classic science fiction story that takes place in an apocalyptic America where the world has been ravaged by a vampiric plague, and we are following the last man alive, Robert Neville, where he pretty much just survives in this apocalyptic wasteland with absolutely no contact with any other living creature. Now, I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I was surprised because it is a classic story. Now, this was written in 1954, so it's not really old, but I had no idea when I was going into this like what to expect, what the writing style would be like, because I have to admit I have struggled with some classics in the past. I was really surprised when I read this that the writing style was so accessible. This could have been published at any time, and I always find it refreshing and surprising when I find a classic that is written in an accessible way. Something else that I particularly loved about this is that this really focuses on Robert Neville's experience, and some of the main themes in this book are loneliness and hopelessness, as he is literally the last human alive in this dire situation. And then the other element of this story that I really loved is the science in it. I mean, I know, science and science fiction. Amongst all of this boredom and tedious survival, Robert Neville needs something to do, so he starts to experiment on the vampires and get to the bottom of this plague, what caused it, why vampires are almost allergic to garlic, why a wooden stake through the heart is what can kill them. I discovered that I actually really like stories that seem supernatural but actually can have a logical or scientific background. Now for a book that was a little bit polarizing, I think I know one other booktuber that likes this book, and that is The Merciful Crow by Margaret Owen. So this was a book I got in a Shelflove crate box and I did a full reading vlog on it. So I read this because it was sent to me, not because I initially had any interest, and I was surprised by how much I really enjoyed this. So this takes place in a world with a caste system, and the caste system are named after birds. Our main character is a crow, which is right at the bottom of the tier, and the crows do face a lot of prejudice for being in the lowest class. Now every class has a magical ability. I believe that they're called birthrights in this. For example, the highest caste is Phoenix and they have access to fire magic. However, the crows don't really have a magical ability. Their job is essentially to clean up the bodies of the victims of the plague and take them away from civilization to stop the plague from spreading, because for some unknown reason their caste is immune to the disease. The crows do receive payment for this, but their payment often comes in the teeth of the dead, which they can then use to harness the power of whichever caste those teeth came from. So one of the biggest complaints I've heard in reviews of this is that the writing style is overworked, and I will admit it is a little bit more complicated than it necessarily has to be, but it does have a very distinctive voice and I really enjoyed that about this. I think I did give this 4 stars overall. My only real complaints is that I felt like some of the plot points could have done with a little bit more development, but I have noticed that that is a very common thing in books from debut authors, which Margaret Owen is, so I will very much forgive that because I believe it's something that will be improved upon with time. I really loved how complex the world in this was, both with the caste system and the magic system, but there is also a really strong political plotline running through here, and I found that the way that the politics worked was fascinating, and that of course leads into there being a very complex world. And I do think that all of the building of the magic system, the political system, and the world building was pretty well done. There were a couple of not necessarily inconsistencies in here, but there were points throughout the book where I did feel like the characters had issues that I could have solved based on what I knew about the world. So it was things like that where I feel like the plot wasn't necessarily the best in the way it was executed, but I think there is a very strong groundwork here and I really loved the world. Now, aside from our main character, we do have 2 other main characters. One is a prince and the other is his bodyguard. I particularly liked the bodyguard in this, and you guys know I'm a sucker for a romance in any fantasy story, and I did really like the romance in this. I'm very interested to see where the sequel to this is going. I believe it's called The Faithless Hawk, and just the title of that scares me, to be honest. But Margaret Owen is an author that I will definitely be keeping an eye on, and I'm really excited for this sequel. Then we have The Beckoning Shadow by Catherine Blair, which was also a book I received from Shelflove crate. Now, I wasn't sure going into this whether I would like it at all, because it's kind of a mix of something like Marvel's The Runaways and Fight Club. So this is an interesting world. I'm not even sure if I would class it as a sci-fi or a fantasy, because the abilities in this book are very superhero-like, but it's not explicit, so I guess it could be fantasy. I don't know, it's hazy. So in this world we have oddities, and oddities are people with these superhero-like abilities. The reason that I compare it to superhero abilities as opposed to fantasy magical abilities is because the abilities are separated by groups. Similar with castes, I guess. There are many people with the same ability and each group has a name. So the main character can summon people's worst fears, and her ability group is called the Harbingers. Now, it is illegal to have these abilities in this world, and there are groups of people that go around and kill people that have abilities. Vesper comes into her powers in her teenage years, and she very quickly realizes that they are outside of her control. She accidentally ends up hurting her family, and because of that she decides to run away. When she's on the run, she does discover a whole group of people who are like herself, and decides that she will stay with them for a while because they are about to participate in a tournament where the prize is $1 million was, and the chance to have something that you deeply regret from your past erased so that the consequences never happened, essentially. Because of this, she teams up with Sam, who is a former MMA fighter that runs a gym for people to train in martial arts, etc. And he teaches her how to fight physically so that she can win the competition, because the other competitors will be only fighting with their abilities and not with physical strength. So this is another one that has quite a complex plot. There's a lot going on in here, but I had no idea what to expect from this. I didn't even think I would like it very much, but I just thought that the way that these two aspects came together was ingenious, because this reads in places almost like a contemporary. We have these magical abilities and the problems that they cause in a modern world, and then we also have the blending with this fighting, like Fight Club aspect, where there's like a whole group of other people who are pretty removed from the magical aspects of the world that are also integral to this plot. I don't know how to describe why I liked this. I mean, the writing style was nothing particularly special. The plot overall, like the plot arc, was a pretty generic plot, but I think it was just the blending of all these elements and how when you read the synopsis, you're not really sure how that is going to pull together into a cohesive story, and it really does. And I found it interesting how the things were completely separated. So there were the group of people with magical abilities, and there were the fighters, and then the main character Vesper kind of winds between the two. And yeah, honestly, I'm not really going to be eloquent about this. I just really like this book, and the way it left off, I was desperate for the sequel because I really enjoyed it that much. And as well as the Merciful Crow, this one also has a romance that I kind of liked, although there is the miscommunication trope in here. So if you really can't stand that, then maybe you won't like this as much as I did. But I am a sucker for an angsty romance that has problems for absolutely no reason, and so this was a hit with me. And then the final book that surprised me in 2019 was There's Someone Inside Your House by Stephanie Perkins. Now, I had heard a lot of mixed reviews about this when I went into it, and it's not something I would have normally read anyway, so I didn't mind picking it up and giving it a try, and I was pleasantly surprised. So this is a slasher movie in a book. It pretty much takes place in a high school setting, and we do have a protagonist that we follow, but it's a slasher plot, so the characters aren't necessarily too important, although of course the main character does have a dark secret just to add to the plot. So I had heard that this was really underwhelming and it could have done much better, so I wasn't expecting much from it going in. I really liked this because it is what it says it is. I went into this knowing that this was a slasher movie in book form, and so that is pretty much all I expected from it, and it delivered. One of the things that I liked about this is that we have two perspectives. We do follow a main character, I think in first person perspective, but there are also chapters from the perspective of the person who is about to be murdered as they are being murdered, or should I say just before they're murdered. And I felt like every time we had one of those chapters, you would find out something new about the serial killer. Now, my one kind of negative with this book is that I was enjoying piecing together who this killer was, and I felt like the reveal of the killer came a little bit too soon in the book, and I would have enjoyed it continuing like that for a little bit longer so I could kind of work it out myself. That being said, this is a slasher movie in a book. I know I've said that multiple times, but that is pretty much all you need to know. If you like slasher movies, which honestly are not critically acclaimed movies, then you will probably enjoy this book. Just don't expect anything more from it than your typical slasher movie plot. So those are the books that surprised me the most in 2019. Please let me know which of the books you read in 2019 surprised you guys the most, and please stay tuned because I do still have my worst and best books of the year's videos to come. But that is it from me today, guys, so please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you want to. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. That's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.